Well, here we have a 1961 Chrysler 300G, the so-called banker's hot rod. This was all new styling for the 300 in 1961, and I'm not quite sure if I care for it or not. It resembles to me the 58 to 60 Lincolns, and maybe a little bit of the 59 Buick in front and out back. It's a acquired taste, shall we say, and one of the last of the Virgil Exner designed cars. But this 300G convertible is super rare. This is one of just 337 that were produced in 1961. And even the 300G Coupe was rare. There were just 1,280 produced in that particular model year. The 300 letter series cars were produced from 1955 all the way through 1965. The 300L was the last of the generation. And in 1955, the 300 was actually called the C300, not the 300C. The 300C would come about in 1957. So you can call the 1955 car almost a 300A, if you will. And the goal was for Chrysler to build a vehicle that was more of a hot rod type vehicle that was aimed at NASCAR circuits, but sold to private owners for homologation purposes for NASCAR. And I think in retrospect, these cars are perhaps more successful today than they were when they were originally sold. None of them were very good sellers, despite being great lookers. But I think part of that was due to the very, very high base price. This 300G carried a base price of $5,841 in 1961. Just for purposes of comparison, a New Yorker convertible was $4,592. A New Yorker four-door sedan was $4,200, and the 300G sedan was about $5,400. Now, what does that mean in terms of today's dollars? Well, multiply by about 10. So the base price on this car was about the equivalent of $58,000 today for the base car without any options. That's how expensive this vehicle was. And back then, remember, there was no 84 or 96 or even 72-month financing. You really were financing cars over 3 or 4 years, really, at best. Here's the big 300G badge on this particular vehicle. And you can see the wonderfully detailed interior with that Chrysler Astrodome instrument panel that is just awesome. The three-dimensional look of it with the Lucite wheel, the push-button torque flight transmission you can see there on the left. I love the tack in the console. It's kind of out of sight, but yeah, that's okay. There's the torque flight with the push buttons. You can see the steering wheel with almost like a splined shaft design, if you will. And the HVAC controls are on the right, and you notice the HVAC air conditioning pods. This car is an air conditioning equipped car that are on the dash. Super funky. This car did come standard with 4-place bucket seats, as you see here. And strangely, the 300G would not have one item that would be incorporated into the other 1961 Chryslers, and that's the so-called high tower driver's seat. You notice all the seats are equal height here, whereas on other Chryslers, that driver's seat or the portion of the driver's seat was actually raised and the backrest was higher than on the other vehicles. As I mentioned, this was an expensive car, and it did come with a fair amount of standard equipment aside from those 4-place seats. One element that it came with was power windows, which really was a rarity in a lot of vehicles at this time and an expensive option on lesser cars. And of course, the most important thing about these 300Gs is what is under hood. And there were a couple different variations of Chrysler's 413 cubic inch Golden Lion V8. No matter which version of the 413 you got an engine that had a forged crankshaft as well as 10.1 to 1 compression ratio. And the difference between the 413 V8s really came down to the intake manifold setup and this so-called ram induction. This ram induction appeared originally in 1960 and it carried over for 1961. And there were two versions of the 413 and ram induction available. The first was a so-called long ram V8 that made 375 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 495 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM. The goal of this particular configuration was more mid-range torque as well as mid-range horsepower. And optional was a so-called short ram version of this engine that made 400 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, and 465, or about 30 pound-feet less of torque than the long ram version, and that occurred at 3,600 RPM. The long ram intake measured 30 inches internally. The short ram measured only 15 inches in length. And as I mentioned, the short ram was the higher horsepower engine but lower torque. The long ram was the lower horsepower, higher torque V8. Either engine was mated to a super durable Chrysler 727 Torque Flight automatic and had a standard 3.23 to 1 final drive ratio out rear. When it came to the chassis, the 300Gs were really just based on the New Yorkers of the era, which meant they rode atop 126-inch unibody. Well, I was going to say frame, but not a frame, a unibody, and had torsion bars up front and leaf springs in the rear. The torsion bars were actually thicker than one that was used on the New Yorker. By the way, here's a beautiful badge on the back. Super cool looking. And were about 40% stiffer than those that were found in the New Yorker. Same was true of the rear leaf springs that were rated for much higher stiffness, about 50% than the standard New Yorker. The cars thankfully came with power steering. I can't imagine trying to steer something like this that weighed about 4,300 pounds without power steering. In any event, and in no matter which configuration one bought their 300G, it was known as a super powerful and highly attractive car. I mean, just imagine sitting behind this dash. I love the Astrodome dash. No other car really had anything like it that was as three-dimensional as this overall dash. And of course, you got lots of buttons on your Chrysler because you had the radio, the HVAC controls, as well as the torque flight that you had to control with its own push buttons. But it was just a wonderful, wonderful car, and it was relatively quick for the time period. Number of car magazines tested these, and the 0 to 60 time was about 8 seconds, which, imagine, for a full-size car and in the early 1960s, was really moving. Most cars at the time had 0 to 60 times about 11 or 12 seconds, so this was considerably faster. And I will say about the engines, it is a little bit hard to discern which engine is a short ram versus a long ram, because despite the fact that the inner intake runner is significantly different in overall length, as I mentioned before, 30 inches versus 15 inches in the short ram version, they are a bit tough to identify visually. The main difference is that the long rams have a casting number that's 7 digits and begins with a 19. The short rams have a 7-digit casting number that begins with a 21. And there are some other differences. You can see that there's a valley between the pair of runners on the long rams, not on the short rams. But the casting number is the easiest way to tell which engine one has. In any case, you're lucky to have a 300G period, given how rare these are. And I think they are just a beautiful vehicle, if a bit of an acquired taste. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the Banker's Hot Rod, the 1961 Chrysler 300G. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.